Greetings, friends. This is Brother Les again, and today we'll be talking about, can you really trust God's Word? And I have a special guest with me, my son Stephen, to whom I'll be asking some questions, and he'll help us address this very important question. Stephen, is the Bible we have today full of errors and unreliable because it's a copy of a copy of a copy made over thousands of years of copying down, and it just got worse over and over time, kind of like the telephone game that people like to play?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the copying and the translation of the Bible is actually not like the telephone game, because in the telephone game, you whisper something in someone's ear, and then they whisper it in another person's ear, and they whisper it in another person, and 15 people down the line, the sentence may be nothing like what the original speaker said. But in the copying and the preservation of the Bible, it's very different, because we're able to trace back to not the original manuscripts, but thousands of years before the manuscripts that comprise our modern New Testaments. And so we're able to go back to almost just a few decades after the time when the original biblical manuscripts were written. So the earliest dating manuscript that we have is from the Gospel of John. It's called P52, and it dates back to about 117 AD. So the book of John, if it was written around 90 to 95, like a lot of scholars say, that would be within about 30 years of the time when the Apostle John originally wrote his Gospel. And the same can be said of a lot of the epistles of Paul. He wrote them in the 50s and in the 60s before he was martyred in 68 AD. And we have manuscripts of a lot of Paul's letters that date back to just within a few decades up to a century of the time that they were written, all through the 2nd century AD. So even though we can't go all the way back to the originals, we do know that the manuscripts that we have are much more accurate than they would be if they had been translated over many thousands of years and we were just having copies of copies of copies. And we look at those really old manuscripts and we find that they're very much like our modern New Testaments. And the same can be said of the Old Testament, because an amazing discovery was the Dead Sea Scrolls, because up until the time, it was 1947, when these were discovered, these ancient scrolls of the Old Testament, then the earliest manuscripts that we had of the Old Testament dated to the Middle Ages. And so people said, well, they were written so many thousands of years before, so surely they've been corrupted and so much has been changed. But we were able to find that they had not been changed very much, except for slight changes in spelling and slight changes in grammar, and of course obvious scribal errors. But the stories and the teachings of the Old Testament have been handed down reliably, and we still have them in their older form in the manuscripts that we have today.
And also regarding the Old Testament, the scribes who did make copies had to be carefully approved to do that, and they had a tremendous reverence for God's Word, didn't they?
Absolutely, and they had so many meticulous requirements, because there was the school of the Masoretes, and then before them there was the school of the Sopharim, and these were two biblical scholar schools that they would copy down all of the Old Testament texts. And they had such stringent requirements, they said that if you made any errors, you had to throw out the scroll. It had to be burned, because they said we cannot let any errors to creep into the text. And so their precise attention to detail, it really paid off in the long run, because we are finding all these manuscripts that are thousands of years old that still look very much like our modern Bibles.
So you don't feel like the Bible has been corrupted over time, which is a charge that I know, for example, the Muslims have made that.
Right, not significantly, because even though there are some manuscripts that are corrupted, we can tell that there has not been a wholesale corruption of the manuscripts. Because first of all, that would be impossible to do. Like, think of during the last persecution before Constantine, it was under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. And Diocletian decreed that all of the New Testaments, all the Bibles, had to be wiped out because he was trying to destroy Christianity. But during that time, he could not get rid of the Bible because it had already been disseminated throughout the entire Roman Empire. And people were not going to turn in their New Testaments that they had believed in and they were willing to give their lives for. They weren't just going to turn those in and let them be destroyed. And so there was no way that anybody could destroy the manuscripts. And then after that, at the time of Constantine, there was no way that there could be some church council that would decide, oh, well, let's change this detail about the Gospels and this detail about the teachings of Christianity, because they were already in these thousands of different manuscripts that were distributed throughout the Roman Empire. So we would have known by now if they had made any major changes, because we would have found manuscripts that had had the older readings. There's no way you could wipe all those out. And the fact that they agree with each other on so many areas, and this is over a very wide base of manuscripts. There's 5,800 Greek manuscripts that have now been discovered, and almost all of them tell the same story. There's very little evidence that any of them have been altered, and even if some of them had been altered majorly, we would still be able to tell from the majority text what the original Gospels and epistles said.
Thank you. That's very helpful, Stephen. What are some good evidences that back up God's Word in archaeology, besides the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you mentioned?
Well, there's been a lot of amazing archaeological investigations that have proved the truth of biblical stories that previously were thought to be mythological. So, for instance, there is the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And whenever there's a story in the Old Testament or anywhere in the Bible that is supernatural in nature, in this case fire comes down from heaven and destroys the city, then skeptics will always say, oh, well, supernatural events are impossible, and so that has to be a myth. But the amazing thing is they've discovered these 5 cities that are in the place of now it's Israel, but in the place of the peninsula right there, where it was believed that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the 3 others that the Bible mentioned were located. And they have found that all 5 of these cities are buried under a coating of ash that's about 3 feet thick. And so it's evidence that the whole city, in each case, was burned by fire. But the thing that they found that was very interesting is that in every case, there was evidence that the fire had started in the ceiling and then it had moved down to the rest of the house. And that's the opposite of the way that great fires in cities normally spread. Because, normally they will start at the ground level and then the flames will leap up and they'll destroy the whole house. And in this case, they found direct evidence of the destruction by fire from heaven, because the fires had started at the roof and spread down. And then the city of Jericho, it's said in the Bible that Joshua and the Israelites marched around the city and that the walls, they fell down. And it was only by the power of God. And obviously that's another thing that can't happen without supernatural power. But the most amazing thing about the investigation of the archaeological investigation of the city of Jericho is that they found that the walls had actually fallen outwards, whereas whenever a city wall in ancient times was attacked by an enemy army, they would bring their battering rams and they would keep on ramming into the walls until they fell down inwards. But in this case, it fell outwards. So apart from willful destruction of the city's walls by the city's own inhabitants inside the city, there's no way you can explain that happening except for the power of God. And other powerful evidences were the fact that they found a large supply of grain in the city. And by the time that a siege in ancient times was finally over, and they had finally broken through and taken the city, oftentimes the whole population inside was reduced to starvation because it took years in ancient times for these sieges to happen. So the fact that there's such a large food supply that was found in the city by these archaeological investigations, it really shows that the city was taken very quickly, and that can only be explained once again by the power of God. And so I could go over a lot of other evidences. There's a lot of evidence for the the Exodus, for example, the chariot wheels that were found buried underneath this beach that's right outside of the Sinai Peninsula, and they date back to the exact time in the 18th dynasty when it is believed that the Israelites had been released from their bondage in Egypt. So, evidence that the sea had indeed parted for the Israelites and that the Egyptians and their chariots were drowned right there. And then there's also a lot of archaeological investigations that have proved the truth of, like a lot of biblical kings and biblical cities that were believed never to have existed. Like King Sargon was believed never to have existed. He was found, his whole palace was found. The Hittites are a nation that was believed never to have existed. Now we have uncovered through archaeology that whole kingdom, and we found that the Bible's statements about it were accurate. And then all the way through to the New Testament, Historian Luke, who wrote two of the books of the Bible, Luke and Acts, he mentions a total of 52 cities and geographical locations, and all of them have now been corroborated by archaeological evidence. And so there was a very skeptical scholar. He was also an archaeologist, and his name was Sir William Ramsay in the early part of last century. And he set out on a mission to disprove the accuracy of the book of Acts. And then he found out at the end of his investigation that everything that Luke mentioned was accurate. He said he was to be considered a first-rate historian, and Sir William Ramsay actually converted to Christianity at the end of his investigations because he found that everything that was mentioned in the Bible was true to the archaeology of the places it mentioned.
Wow, that's great. I don't know if we have time to talk about fulfilled prophecy, but of course Christ is shown over and over again by the writers of the New Testament to have fulfilled so many prophecies. Well, another very big evidence that backs up God's Word is transformed lives. Over many centuries, people sometimes coming out of prostitution, drug addiction, and perhaps some of our viewers, this is true with you, or people that you know about, transformed lives, radically transformed by the power of God's Word. I want to wrap this up by reading a short summary about the uniqueness of God's Word. It was written by 40 authors in 3 languages over 1,500 years, and yet it has a unifying theme of redemption. It contains hundreds of fulfilled prophecies. Many of the ancient places it mentions have already been discovered, as Stephen was mentioning, like Ur of Chaldees, Jericho, and Sodom. It contains scientific foreknowledge, things that the ancient people couldn't have known, and here is one of them, Isaiah 40, verse 22. It states that God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. The New Testament has many thousands of accurately preserved manuscripts to back up its authenticity. And despite many who have tried to destroy it, the Bible has proved indestructible. Millions of people have found Christ the world over and had their lives transformed as they have read, believed, and obeyed God's Word, the Bible. So friend, I challenge you to treasure God's Word. Love and reverence it. Did you know that there's a whole chapter in Psalm 119, where the psalmist describes how much he loves God's law, God's Word. And we need to do that too. You know, Job said he treasured the words of God's mouth more than his daily bread. We need to memorize it and meditate upon it. Psalm 1 starts off, "Blessed is the man." Can you say a little bit more of that psalm, Stephen?
"Who does not walk in the way of sinners, or stand in the way of the ungodly, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by streams of water, whose leaf does not wither, and whatever he does prospers."
And something very similar to that is found in Joshua 1:8. "Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful." And if that command was given to Joshua and the psalmist reiterated it, well, it's still important for us, isn't it? But we need to combine it with faith. So we need to believe and obey God's Word. We need to come to God's Word hungry, as Isaiah 55 exhorts us to do. Do so. And in that chapter, he talks about that just like the rain and the snow falling from the skies will have a great effect on the plant life. Well, God's Word is supernaturally empowered to do that on us. So friend, let God's Word transform your life. Don't just read it every now and then. Come to God's Word throughout the day. Pray God's Word. Believe it and obey it, and watch what God will do in your life. Thank you, and God bless you.